In their suppression of their knowledge of God, where they come up with petty excuses to not submit to their Maker, unbelievers, quote-unquote, often bring up the issue of slavery and the Bible. They claim that since the Bible permits slavery, it is therefore immoral and should not be followed. Now, leaving aside the fact that if atheism were true, nothing would be wrong, including slavery, since all you would have is one random biological organism that appeared on a random rock, owning another random biological organism, without any objective standard condemning such a concept, it is nevertheless important to address this argument. This is because when biblical slavery is mentioned by such people, it is meant to incite an emotional reaction connected with the racist slavery of the American South in the 18th and 19th centuries, or the brutal instances of slavery in the ancient world. One can think of the classic movie Ben-Hur, where slaves had chains around their necks and were worked to death, etc. However, to read such concepts into Old Testament Israelite servanthood the Bible permits, or the foreign slavery it permits, would be extremely inaccurate and deceptive. The following facts serve as reasons why biblical servanthood and foreign slavery was not immoral in the sense modern English parlance defines slavery.
So slavery in the Old Testament, well, in Exodus 20 and 21, God talks a lot about the laws having to do with slavery. He says, as part of the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, nor thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. So we're talking about property here, and manservant and maidservant is just a kind of a sugar coating of slave, male slave and female slave.
Slave and master are not the best translations of Ebed and Adon. The Hebrew word used for slave or servant in the relevant Old Testament texts is Ebed. It simply means employee or servant and should not be translated as slave in such contexts. Paul Copan has noted Old Testament scholar John Goldingay affirms, quote, "There is nothing inherently lowly or undignified about being an Ebed. Instead, it was an honorable and dignified term," unquote. Likewise, on page 713, the Brown Driver Briggs lexicon notes the word can refer to a servant of a household and cites Exodus 21:2 as an example, one of the texts we will cover. On page 633, Mounce's dictionary also defines it as servant. An Adon in Hebrew was a boss or employer in these contexts, and master is a bit too strong of a translation. See Paul Copan has Got a Moral Monster, page 125. Copan also relays, quote, "Even when the terms buy, sell, or acquire are used for servants/employees, they don't mean the person in question is just property. Rather, these are formal contractual agreements, which is what we find in the Old Testament servanthood/employee arrangements. One example of this contracted employer/employee relationship was Jacob's working for Laban for 7 years so that he might marry his daughter Rachel," unquote. Now, indentured servitude existed as a means of debt payment. These employees lived with and worked for a family in order to pay off a debt. See Exodus 21:2, Leviticus 25:35 and 47, and Deuteronomy 15:12. This is similar to what took place in 17th century colonial America, where European immigrants could not afford passage into America, and so worked for a family in order to pay them back for paying for their passage. See Joshua Rosenblum, Indentured Servitude in the Colonial U.S. God set up servitude as a last resort means of survival. The Old Testament affirms God ordained servitude for people to be able to survive when all other means of survival were exhausted. People would put themselves into indentured servitude to survive. See Deuteronomy 15:16 and Leviticus 25:47. The conditions of this servitude must now be discussed in order to dispel atheist claims. Old Testament servants were more like live-in butlers or nannies. They did not walk around with chains around their neck, enduring racism or being worked to death. The rights and dignity of these indentured servants in the Old Testament make these comparisons to Ben-Hur slavery or modern American racist slavery in the South erroneous. For example, Exodus 21 demands these servants be treated as persons, not as property. If a servant who owed a debt came in with his wife, then after 6 years they both were allowed to leave together, not just one. Verse 3. Deuteronomy 15:16 shows servants often truly loved the leaders of the household and thought of them as family. Leviticus 25:53-54 says servants were to be treated as men, quote, hired from year to year, unquote, not, quote, ruled over ruthlessly, unquote. They were even to be given a regular day off during the week, Exodus 23:12. Exodus 21:26-27 says that if a boss injured a servant, the servant was to be set free. Such abuse was not tolerated. Also, Israelite servants could not be sold by their bosses. See Leviticus 25:42. Lastly, Deuteronomy 15:13-14 affirms once a servant's service was over after 6 years, he was not to leave empty-handed. The boss was commanded to furnish him out of his flock, also with corn and wine. All of these facts destroy the emotional response atheists want to bring out of people when telling them, the Bible permits slavery. The images of slaves in the movie Ben-Hur, or of slavery in the American South in the 18th and 19th centuries, have been disproven. Moreover, lifelong servitude was forbidden. Exodus 21:2 and Deuteronomy 15:12 commands a servant who owed a debt to be freed after 6 years. However, if the servant decided to remain with the household longer due to loving the family, he was permitted to stay with that family. See Deuteronomy 15:16, Exodus 21:5. For example, Deuteronomy 15:16 says, "But if he says to you, I will not go out from you, because he loves you and your household, since he is well off with you, he shall be your slave forever." Unquote. This shows the servants were to be treated very well, so much so that many chose to remain with their leaders of their household forever because of the good treatment and care exhibited by the Israelite boss. Foreign slaves. Now that we have addressed the Israelite indentured servitude the atheists in the video brought up, we will now turn to the issue of foreign slaves the Israelites were allowed to purchase. In Leviticus 25:45-46, we read that Israelites were permitted to buy foreign slaves who were in the slave trade. Although this might sound harsh to our ears, some things need to be kept in mind. First, there are no chains around necks, racism, or being worked to death here. Also, such people had rights even if they ran away from their bosses. Deuteronomy 23:15-16 says, quote, "You shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst, in the place that he shall choose within one of your towns, wherever it suits him. You shall not wrong him." Unquote. This law greatly affected the master's treatment of the worker, so they wouldn't want to run away. Also, this is an example of God's mercy since he permitted Israelites to rescue slaves out of the slave trade and work for a family in a holy culture, when they would otherwise be stuck in some brutal culture where their master could treat slaves however they wanted. Hammurabi's code, for example, allowed masters to mutilate their slaves, cutting their ears off, etc. Exodus 21:26-27, however, says injuring slaves was forbidden, and if done resulted in the release of the slave. This was great incentive to treat them well, an oddity in the ancient world at that time. Old Testament scholar Walter Kaiser confirms, quote, "In the ancient world a master could treat a slave as he pleased." Unquote. See Walter Kaiser, Exodus, page 433. So much has to be read in, and much has to be omitted in order for this to be identified as morally evil. So while the unbeliever, though he has no moral basis to claim anything is actually wrong, claims this slavery was wrong, the fact is, it served as a way of rescuing those stuck in the slave trade, who would otherwise end up in a savage land being mutilated. The Hebrews were to treat these people well, on the other hand, and it was common understanding that the foreign slave could run away to another town for asylum in Israel, and would not be returned to his Israelite master. This is utterly unprecedented in the ancient world. Lastly, according to the Old Testament, such foreign slaves could basically become Israelite citizens. For example, 1 Chronicles 2:34-35 affirms Sheshan gave his Egyptian slave Jarha to his daughter in marriage, after which they had a child together. Again, this is utterly disconnected from the ancient practice. Troubling texts. Now, atheists commonly attack Exodus 21:20-21.
Kinder and gentler, but in Exodus 21, 20-21, and if a man should smite his servant or his maid with a rod, and he die under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Notwithstanding, if he continue a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his money. So it's not good to beat your slave to death, but if you kill them indirectly, that's okay, because they're his money.
Notice first, according to verse 20, the murder of servants is strongly prohibited and was punishable by death. Unbelievers often ignore this and throw it under the bus. However, it is a very merciful truth that needs to be kept in mind. But what should we make of verse 21? Simple. The boss is given the benefit of the doubt that he was not intending to murder the servant, but was disciplining him for doing some moral wrong he was not supposed to do. In that case, the boss would not be put to death, since it would be ruled accidental. This did not mean the bosses should try to make it so that their servants died after 2 days, or that this was somehow moral or okay. The text doesn't say that. It's simply saying if such an accidental death occurred after a disciplinary punishment, the boss did not deserve death. Life for a life applied only when there was conscious intent to murder. But more needs to be said. What about the above rendering, "For the slave is his money," at the end of verse 21, which seems to suggest the servant was property? This is incorrect. The Hebrew does not say the slave is his money. It just says that is his money. Copan notes the ancient Near East scholar Harry Hoffner has shown, based on the context, that is Exodus 21:18-19, that the text should not be rendered "the slave is his money," but, quote, "the fee is his money," in the sense that the fee the boss would then pay for medical treatment for the soon-to-die injured servant was money. Therefore, since the boss would already suffer financial loss for the accidental fatality, he would not be put to death. See Harry Hoffner, Slavery and the Slave Laws in Ancient Haiti and Israel, published in 2008. Hence, according to the Hebrew and the context, the text does not say the slave is his money, as atheists falsely assert. It is saying the death was accidental, the boss tried to save the servant by paying for medical treatment, as the context shows, and because of these considerations the boss should not be executed, since his punishment for this tragic accidental death was money he paid in trying to save the servant. Now, unbelievers also bring up Exodus 21:7-11, which mentions a man selling his daughter as an amah, which is sometimes rendered slave or servant. However, based on contextual considerations, Old Testament scholar Walter Kaiser notes, quote, "This pericope pertains to a girl who was sold by her father, not for slavery, but for marriage. Nonetheless, she is designated a servant, Amma, in verse 7. Should the terms of marriage not be fulfilled, it is to be considered a breach of contract, and the purchaser must allow the girl to be redeemed. She must not be sold outside that family," verse 8. "Always she must be treated as a daughter or a free-born woman, or the forfeiture clause will be invoked," unquote. Walter Kaiser, Exodus, in the Expositor's Bible Commentary, Volume 2, page 430. In sum, it is clear atheists read into the Old Testament other forms of slavery and do not allow the texts to speak for themselves. They blindly, without knowledge of the Hebrew, context, or cultural background, attack Old Testament servitude out of ignorance because of their rebellion and hatred for God. They take what is not immoral at all and twist it into something immoral as an excuse not to submit to their Creator.
The Bible is very pro-slavery, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the Civil War and its epic failure, and talk about how slavery can be made an analogy with gay rights today.
Slavery in the New Testament. Atheists often falsely claim that Jesus never condemned the slavery of his day.
So in the New Testament, you'd think Jesus could come out and say, well, let's fix this thing, but he doesn't.
However, in Luke 4:18, Jesus cites Isaiah 61:1, which, in practical application, condemns the slavery of his day, quote, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed," unquote. Luke 4:18. Now, unbelievers often argue that since the New Testament writers exhorted slaves to obey their masters in the Roman social system, this is therefore immoral and proves the Bible is false.
This thing, but he doesn't. So I have a bunch of quotes. I have Titus 2:9, Colossians 3:22, Ephesians 6:5.
However, a few points are in order. These texts do not support Roman slavery. The fact is, Jesus and the apostles didn't create an economic reform plan for Israel and Rome. That's not the way the kingdom of God would come about. The kingdom of God is inward and culminates with the return of Christ at the end of the world. So economic reform was not the goal of the early persecuted Christians. The church was born into an already existing secular social world. So when Paul exhorts slaves within the Roman system to behave themselves, he is not promoting or advocating the situation they were in, but was calling for good conduct while already in such an existing predicament, in the hopes that the master would see such good conduct and convert to Christianity and be saved. See Titus 2:10. It was therefore for the benefit of the people's eternal salvation. Now, Paul exhorts slave masters to treat their slaves well. In Ephesians 6:8-9, Paul commands those who are slave masters in this existing social system to be good to and not threaten their slaves. Again, this is not advocating or supporting slavery, but calling for humane protocol since people already existed in this system, and small persecuted Christianity had no means for economic reform for Israel and Rome. Paul affirmed freedom over slavery. Gleason Archer has shown that while Paul exhorted slaves to obey their masters, respect them, and be faithful, he also said slaves should seek to purchase their freedom as soon as possible, 1 Corinthians 7:21, which shows that Paul recognized freedom is better than slavery. See Gleason Archer Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties, page 87. This refutes the atheist objection. The Bible does not support slave and master classes. The following texts show the Bible affirms the equality of all men, which is opposed to the idea behind slavery, such ideas which can be found in Greco-Roman philosophers such as Aristotle. For example, Galatians 3:28 says, quote, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ." 1 Corinthians 12:13 says, "For in one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and all were made to drink of one Spirit," unquote. Colossians 3:11 says, "Here there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, but Christ is all and in all," unquote. In Colossians 4:1, Paul affirms both slaves and masters are equal, having a true master in heaven, and that masters on earth must not mistreat their slaves. Again, unbelievers do not mention this. They just assume Paul supported slavery, when really he was giving protocol for good conduct in the context of an already existing social system. That does not necessitate support. That would be like me exhorting homosexuals to wear protection and not spread AIDS. It wouldn't mean I support sodomy, it would just mean I am calling for protocol in an already existing situation. The New Testament writers, though they did not support these slave master classes, nevertheless did not call for violent uprising against Rome, because they did not want Christianity to be characterized or viewed as having that kind of emphasis. The Bible condemns slavery and the slave trade. In 1 Timothy 1:9-10, Paul castigates those who engage in slave trade in the context of his vice list of things to avoid. Why don't unbelievers ever mention this? Moreover, in Revelation 18:10-14, Babylon is rebuked and judged in the context of treating humans as cargo, trafficking slaves, and idolatrously and greedily making wealth with merchants. In sum, this is the other side of the story which militant atheists do not inform people about when they rant against the Bible on this issue. This is because they do not really care about truth. Their agenda does not allow them for careful and responsible handling of these issues. This is a response to a quote-unquote unbeliever named Phyllis on YouTube, who attempted to address some of the points in my recent slavery video. First, she tries to say atheism can account for right and wrong, and that atheists do not need to borrow from the Christian worldview. However, in her talk, she fails to prove this at all.
That is the incorrect claim that atheists have no basis for morality, and we therefore must borrow our morality from Christianity. We have an explanation for morality, and it doesn't come from religion, any religion. It is religion that stole morality from people. Morality comes from evolution. We see morality in social animals. It stems from empathy and compassion.
So begging the question on macroevolution and then asserting morality stems from empathy and compassion does not prove anything is actually right or wrong given atheism. So atheism does not justify morality or things being right or wrong. The problem this lady's not addressing is we all live like certain things are truly right and wrong, but which worldview accounts for things being truly right or wrong? That's the question. Well, if atheistic naturalistic materialism is true, humans are stardust, random meat sacks who appeared on this random rock by chance, with no innate objective value or dignity. Thus, what happens to one stardust can't be truly wrong or right. Unbelieving thought contradicts valid human experience, which shows things are truly right and wrong. This is why we make laws. This is why we're all aghast when we see something wicked on the news. And this is why all decent people would agree child rape would be wrong, even if all the minds on the planet, for some reason, deemed it to be okay. Phyllis's idea that empathy accounts for morality is spurious. Empathy says, I don't want something wrong to happen to others because I wouldn't like it to happen to me. Well, why is something happening to you wrong or right? Moral or immoral? You're just stardust. You may say it's good for humans to be happy and not suffer, but in atheism, why is that good? Why is that moral? Again, people would be random meat sacks on some random rock with no innate or objective value. Why is some biological meat sack interpreting events positively through sense perception actually moral or good? You see, atheism cannot make sense out of the absolute morality we all experience and live by. Christianity, on the other hand, explains why we live as though there is true good and bad, and accounts for good and bad. An objective moral code is written on the heart of man by God, reflecting his eternal holy nature. This is why things are actually good or bad, and why we live as though there is real good or bad. Thus, Christianity accounts for human experience on morality, while unbelieving thought reduces it to a delusion leading to nihilism, or things not being truly good or bad. Thus, logically, in atheism, child rape and murder is not truly wrong or immoral. Neither was the Holocaust. This is just stardust bumping into stardust. So Phyllis begged the question and failed to prove atheism can justify morality. Next, she dismisses my claim that employee/servant and boss are better translations for Adon and Ebed in relevant contexts. However, she doesn't deal with the lexical analysis I provided, nor the scholarly references, nor the biblical example of Jacob working for Laban. Instead, she says,
However, employee is not an acceptable translation, as these people were not paid a salary.
yes, they were paid a salary. They were given a debt they owed in the past, Deuteronomy 15:1. That was their salary they were paying off with work. This is why Hebrew debt slaves worked 6 years to pay off their debt, then they were released. So to say these were not employees is absurd. This was a contractual agreement. Also, there was indentured servitude as a means of survival, and the salary was survival, home, food, clothing, etc. See Leviticus 25:39-40. Certain Jews put themselves into this as a last resort means of survival, which I mentioned in the video, but which this lady conveniently ignored on this point.
Keith also claims that the terms buy, sell, or acquire are formal contractual agreements. Does that make owning people and making them work without wages moral or ethical?
What is unethical about a random biological meat sack owning another one, given atheism? Why is this wrong in your worldview? It causes unnecessary harm somehow? So what? Why is that wrong given atheism, since men are just stardust with no innate objective value, interpreting their senses a certain way? How do you know this is wrong? You see, you're making moral statements your professed worldview cannot justify, because deep down you assume an objective standard of right and wrong that only Christianity can provide a basis for, since it affirms morality being objective, based on God's eternal holy nature, written on the hearts of men. But no, as for her question, as Copan argued, as is with the case of Jacob and Laban, the buy-sell language is contractual. The servant would agree to work, i.e. sell himself into work, for the family for 6 years to pay off a debt or survive, when they had no other means of survival. So the person was not seen as mere property. It was a work agreement, similar to a butler or nanny. Nothing you say refutes this.
He claims that God ordained servitude as a means of survival. Is this the best God can do for his people? He can't explain that employing people for wages would be better than slavery. God can't proclaim, "Thou shalt not own other people."
Is this the best God can do? Yeah, and you call yourself an atheist who has no hostility to God? Right. Well, like I said, nothing is truly wrong given atheism, so I'm not going to let you get away with speaking like things are, because by doing so you borrow from my worldview. Plus, to answer the question, if you're paying off a debt, why would you be paid money by your boss? This lady has not thought through what she's saying. The whole point of 6 years of work and then furnishing the person out of your stock once they were released was meant to eradicate debt servanthood from the land totally and help people get on their feet. See Deuteronomy 15:12-14. This is not being considered properly.
He says that Exodus 21 demands that these people be treated as persons, not property. Yet Exodus 21 is all about buying and selling people.
Again, the buying and selling language is contractual to pay off debts, or as a last resort means of survival for the poor person who has absolutely nothing. A father of a family with failed crops, etc., would sell himself off to an Israelite boss. See Leviticus 25:47. So this servanthood wasn't imposed by an outsider, despite the language that you don't understand. It was willing. So just because the terms sell and buy are used, you shouldn't get hung up on that. It's similar to when a sports player gets traded to another team to which he now belongs. Just because such terms are used, it doesn't mean it's not voluntary. And yes, my case, servants were to be treated well, was backed up by much evidence you didn't even address or mention. For example, Leviticus 25:53 says such servants were to be treated as men hired from year to year, not ruled over ruthlessly. They were even to be given a regular day off of the week, Exodus 23:12. Also, Israelite servants could not be sold by their bosses, Leviticus 25:42. Lastly, Deuteronomy 15:13-14 affirms once a servant's service was over after 6 years, he was not to leave empty-handed. The boss was commanded to furnish him out of his flock. And as I showed in the video, many decided to stay with their bosses because they loved them so much. So that does imply being treated well.
It also declares that if an ox known to have previously gored someone then gores again, the owner of the ox will be put to death. However, if the ox gores a slave, the ox owner only has to recompense the slave owner 30 shekels.
Yeah, this is false. Exodus 21:28 says if an ox gores a regular person, the owner doesn't get put to death. So when Exodus 21:32 says if a slave gets gored by an ox and the owner doesn't get put to death, it's the same as for the non-slave in verse 28. Only when the ox is known to gore and gores again does the owner get put to death. So by omitting verse 28, which says the owner won't die when even regular people get gored, Phyllis shows her deceptive character.
Keith also talks about Deuteronomy 15:16, in which a servant might wish to stay with his master after 6 years because he is better off there. However, what Keith doesn't mention is that in this case, the servitude becomes lifelong. There is no consideration that the servant may change his mind in another 6 years or so.
Why would a worker choose to live with his boss forever out of love and being well off with him, make such a radical decision if he was not sure that's what he wanted for life? Also, this idea the boss would not let the servant go if the servant truly changed his mind years later is not actually found in the text, contrary to Phyllis's assertion. If it was such a loving relationship, as we are told it was, why would the boss not let the servant go if the servant truly wanted to? See the illogic? According to the Old Testament, lifelong servants could potentially become equal to free Israelite citizens. For example, 1 Chronicles 2:34-35 again affirms Sheshan gave his Egyptian slave Jarha to his daughter in marriage, after which they had a child together, etc. So this refutes this lady's premise.
Keith claims that Exodus 21:26-27 says that if a boss injured a servant, the servant was to be set free as such abuse was not tolerated. However, those verses do not say that a servant injured in any way by his master is to be set free.
So Phyllis, based on her literalistic interpretation, is arguing that it's okay to be abusive and violent towards your servant as long as you don't damage their eye or tooth. However, why then does Leviticus 25:53 say such servants were to be treated as men hired from year to year, not ruled over ruthlessly? Why does Deuteronomy 15:16 affirm servants often loved their bosses and sought to stay with them forever willingly if it was permitted to abuse them viciously whenever you wished, as long as you didn't knock out a tooth or injure an eye? See the illogic? What the lady doesn't understand is by saying if a man injured the eye of a servant he was to go free, or if he knocks out his tooth he's to go free, it's not so much about only those two specific injuries, but any serious injury. See Kaiser's commentary on Exodus, page 434. So this was a great reason to treat servants well, seeing as they knew if they injured them, they would suffer financial loss since the servant would be freed before their debt was paid. As for discipline being allowed in verse 20, Old Testament scholar Douglas K. Stewart notes this was in response to serious wrongdoings like stealing from their employer. So the idea is not that it's okay to be brutal against a servant when you feel like it. If they stole or did some wrongdoing, the boss could discipline them, but not seriously injure or kill them. Verses 20-21, 26-27. Stewart argues the illegitimacy of arguing against this, quote, "Corporal punishment remains widely in use in the modern world, being built into the familial and even formal legal structures of many nations. It was virtually universally practiced in the ancient world, and predominant in the modern Western world until the latter part of the 20th century. Although many modern Westerners would today regard slapping, spanking, caning to be forms of abuse, it should be noted that their opinions are not historically grounded," unquote. Douglas K. Stewart, commentary on Exodus, page 490, note 131.
Keith cites Leviticus 25:42 to prove that Israelite servants could not be sold by their masters. But the problem is the fact that they could buy and sell non-Hebrew slaves.
Which is why I have an entire section dealing with the buying of non-Hebrew slaves in the video, which this woman doesn't deal with. So watch the video again.
He cites Deuteronomy 23:15-16 in an attempt to make it look as if the Israelites treated all slaves mercifully. These verses state that the Israelites were not to give up an escaped slave to his master. However, this is talking about slaves who have escaped from the enemies of the Israelites.
No, this is not evidenced. As Old Testament scholar David J.A. Kleins notes, quote, "There is not the faintest evidence in the text for such an interpretation," unquote. On the way to the postmodern Old Testament essays, page 98. The text taken as written refers both to Hebrew and foreign slaves. Moreover, what Phyllis doesn't mention is in the ancient Near East, typically it was forbidden by law to harbor runaway slaves in your home. So this great act of mercy shown by God in this law is completely overlooked by the unbeliever, because they do not want to see good in what God does. This is because they hate God and His Word, just like Scripture says.
Leviticus 25:46 gives the Israelites permission to handle them as harshly as they like.
No, that's wrong again. All verse 46 says is you may not rule over Israelites ruthlessly or harshly. Not that it's then okay to be ruthless to foreign slaves. That's not actually in the text. That has to be read into the text. It's therefore eisegesis and not exegesis. Indeed, that such people were to be treated well again. Exodus 21:26-27 affirms injuring slaves was forbidden, and if done resulted in the release of the slave. This was great incentive to treat them well, an oddity in the ancient world at that time. Old Testament scholar Walter Kaiser notes, in the ancient world a master could treat his slave as he pleased, unquote. And indeed, surrounding cultures allowed owners to mutilate their slaves, cutting their ears off, etc., as I showed in the initial video. Thus, Israelites acquiring such people, saving them out of such lands, is a great mercy from God. To ignore this is just to show you hate God and truth. There's no evidence of chains around necks, racism, or being worked to death in the text. That's how we know it wasn't commonplace.
Keith would have us believe that Exodus 21:20 states that beating a slave to death is punishment by death. That is not what the translation should be. It states that the servant's death would be avenged or punished, but does not state what that entails.
Yes, it does state what that entails. He shall be avenged refers to life for life. Avenged is to be read in light of the context in verse 12 of the same chapter, which says, quote, "Whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death," unquote. That's how we know what it's talking about. Also, 3 verses later, mention is made of life for a life. So again, context thoroughly supports Exodus 21:20, saying that if a boss kills a servant, the boss is to be put to death. Thus, this ruthlessness Phyllis wants to associate with Israelite bosses towards servants is unfounded. Now, I think this all shows that Phyllis doesn't really know what she's talking about, but the most important point is that she has no real standard to say anything is truly immoral, let alone biblical servanthood. Claiming evolution and empathy cause people to feel things are wrong does not prove anything is actually wrong given your worldview. It just means your worldview forces morality to be a delusion, and that you are a sucker for still claiming and living like certain things are actually truly wrong. This is the folly of atheism. So like Van Til said, the unbeliever is like a child sitting on his father's lap, slapping his father. The only reason he can slap the father is because the father is holding him up. Likewise, the only reason Phyllis can attack God on moral issues and live like things are truly right and wrong is because Christianity alone provides the necessary preconditions for an objective moral framework, that is God's law reflecting His eternal holy nature being in the hearts of men. Thanks for watching.